I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, the U.S. is sending another $1 billion in aid to Ukraine. But will it be enough to hold off Russia? And with Republican sentiments on the U.S. support faltering, where does that leave the country long term? Plus, the lawyer who prosecuted Whitey Bulger joins me on the law behind Donald Trump's prosecution in Georgia and how the former president's case is shaping up so far. After a year and a half of all-out war, how is Ukraine holding up against Russia? U.S. officials have been painting a promising picture as they announce plans to send another $1 billion worth of aid to the country 4 months into her latest push against Vladimir Putin's troops.
We've seen good progress in the counteroffensive, which is very heartening. We want to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs not only to succeed in the counteroffensive, but has what it needs for the long term.
But even with the extra support, how strong are Ukraine's prospects really? To discuss, I'm joined by Carol Savitz, a senior advisor for MIT's Security Studies program and a research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Carol, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So give us your sort of high-level assessment. How is the Ukrainian counteroffensive going? We're hearing everything from disastrously to very well.
Well, I don't think it's disastrously, but I don't think it's blooming and wonderful either. I think that from what I've been reading, and you're probably reading the same things that I am, I think that the Ukrainians are making a modicum of progress in the south, in the Zaporizhia region, and apparently they've broken through at some points in Russian defenses, and the issue is to try to cut the supply lines down from Crimea. The Russians, meantime, seem to have made incremental progress in the north around Bakhmut, and there's still very intensive fighting around there. So it's kind of hard to judge. One of my colleagues yesterday used the phrase a balance of attrition, and I kind of like that. I mean, I think we're in this for a long haul, regardless of how much more aid we give them and regardless of Putin's trip or Kim Jong-un's trip to Russia and getting more artillery shells and things like that.
This really does seem more like something out of the First World War.
Yes.
I
know, I totally agree, and that's the analogy that most people are using, except that it's the First World War with drones and all kinds of other equipment, of course, obviously didn't exist in, the early 1900s.
So in the First World War, what we saw is a battle of attrition until essentially German collapse in late 1918, right? So what we say is warfare tends to be at stable until it isn't.
Right.
Are the Ukrainians planning on the prospect that if they're able to sever Russian supply lines, they might be able to trigger something like that? Or is the assumption that this is just going to go on?
I think there are several factors involved. One is how quickly the Ukrainian army can assimilate all the new technology and equipment that we in the West are giving them. I don't know at what point Putin will cry uncle. I'm not sure we know what that point is. A lot of us are speculating that if Ukraine can push them back to the 2014 lines, after the initial assault on Ukraine, that maybe there would be a chance for negotiation. I read today that some of the Russian soldiers are just deserting and the Russian lines may be collapsing, but I can't prove that at the moment. We just don't know. I would argue that I would think Ukrainian morale is much higher than the Russian morale, and that'll be a big piece because they're defending their home territory. They have aid from civilians, and you hear stories about little old ladies using their smartphones to say when the drones are coming or when the missiles are coming. And Russia doesn't have that support. At the same time, we're hearing about Ukrainian drone attacks in various areas in Russia, basically to bring the war home, to sort of shake up this complacency on the part of the Russian population, and to understand that they too could be vulnerable. And I think that's a really important piece of what's going on.
So assuming Western support for Ukraine stays constant,
right,
it seems like time would be on the Ukrainian side as their forces get stronger and the Russian defense industrial base sort of continues to erode. Is that right?
I don't know. I mean, where do you factor in the fact that the Iranians and Russians are cooperating on drone technology and they are supposedly helping Russia build a drone factory in Tatarstan? How do we factor in, as I alluded to before, this Kim Jong-un trip to Vladivostok? What does that mean? How much material will the North Koreans actually provide to the Russians? Will that be the edge somehow? I mean, we kind of know that they're running out of artillery shells and ammunition, but if North Korea steps up in a big way, How do you call that? I honestly don't have an answer for you.
It says something strange about the world that Russia is now dependent on North Korean supplies as opposed to.
One would think they'd be embarrassed, but obviously there's no embarrassment here.
There has been a change. But I guess the big if in my question was if Western support stays constant.
Right.
European support has been, I think, more than many of us expected going into the war, and consistently so. And American support has been, but what we're seeing is the sort of parts of the Republican Party seeming to oppose it, although strikingly not Republican voters who are pretty strongly supportive of Ukraine, but some members of the Republican Party leadership seem to be drawing back. Do you assess that as being a real threat to continued American support?
I think ultimately it could be. I mean, we're about to have a showdown over the next year's budget and everything else, and part of the issue, one of the issues is how much aid to provide to Ukraine. I mean, there's this little piece of me that thinks that Putin thinks if he only holds out long enough, Donald Trump will be reelected, and then he has nothing to worry about because Trump has already said he would stop all aid to Ukraine, and Putin therefore wins. That would be a tough shift, but it's also possible.
So, to step away from Ukraine just for a moment, what would that say about America's position in the world to our allies if the United States were to withdraw its support from Ukraine because of a change in administration, or even without, simply because of Republican opposition in Congress without a change in administration?
I don't think the Republican opposition is strong enough yet to sunder all the aid that we're providing to Ukraine. I think that there's a big faction in the Senate, certainly, that wants to continue supporting Ukraine and understands how valuable it is. I think it's the so-called MAGA Republicans in the House who would like to turn it around, but that's sort of in obeisance to Trump and everything else, because Trump keeps talking about how he would do things differently, and once he's elected, the war will be over in a day, but we all know why the war would be over in a day.
So then, zooming back in, I think, the political science on wars is they're either very short or very long.
Right.
And we've clearly passed the very short stage of this one. Yeah. So then, going forward, what are your expectations for are we going to see World War I style conflict for the next 2 to 3 years in Eastern Europe? That's what the models would tell you.
Right. I think at least through 2024. I hesitate to predict beyond that. I don't see anything at the moment that's enticing either the Ukrainians or the Russians to the negotiating table, unless there's something that we can't predict at the moment. I can't see Zelensky suddenly saying, well, okay, we'll compromise now. And, there's this big push on the part of some people to kind of force him to say, okay, we're going to, it's time to negotiate, we're going to stop. And I don't see Putin, because he staked everything on it, wanting to give up at this point. And that's why I said before, I don't know where that line is, where he would cry uncle. I think we learned a lot from the Prigozhin episode also, that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the military has been carried out, but there's also reporting that some of the oligarchs are funneling billions of dollars into the Russian military effort. So the sanctions are working, sort of. And I don't see all of their money flowing into the war effort and everything else. One thing to watch for, is there another round of conscription, and how is that received by the general population? That may tell us something about how long the Russian war effort will continue.
So, we saw this sort of comic opera Russian coup, which, was all and just evaporated with Prigozhin's death now.
Right.
Was that a sign of larger fissures in the Russian state, or was it just, Putin having a feud with his cook?
I don't think it was a coup attempt. I think that's one thing I would correct you on. I think it was an attempt to push out Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the head of the general staff. But I don't think it was a coup against his friend, supposedly, Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin had really been talking truth to power. It was kind of all the last several telegram messages and everything else were basically, the emperor has no clothes, we shouldn't be here, NATO was never going to attack us, Ukraine was not planning to attack us, it's all a sham, and their kids aren't going to war. So I think that made him dangerous to Putin. The fact that Putin waited for the 24 hours or whatever it was, even after they had reached Rostov and moved further, showed that he didn't quite know what to do at first. He was almost like, it's a deer in the headlights, is the expression. But so afterwards, people began to say, well, if he was so indecisive, what actually is is he doing? And then he waited the 2 months to take down Prigozhin's plane. That's my theory, anyhow.
So this whole affair has sort of put the lie to the theory that was brooded about by some people of Putin, the sort of genius chess player, which doesn't seem to be holding up very well right now. Given that, are we just waiting for events on the battlefield, or do you expect something else to happen, whether it be a Russian escalation, intervention by foreign, further intervention by foreign powers with greater Chinese support or anything like that? Or are we essentially waiting for the soldiers to have their say?
I think that's a really tough question. I thought you were going to ask me a different question, which is about Putin's fate, to see if something like that would happen. I think the taking down of the plane was a signal to other people who might have had doubts about Putin that he's in charge and don't you dare cross the boss kind of thing. So I think he's allayed the immediate fear of any kind of coup against him. Again, I think the issue is going to be the morale of the soldiers on the battlefield. If they decide that they need more recruits, can they do another massive conscription? And will people, 200,000 or 300,000 people fled fled Russia a year ago? What's going to happen the next time? And those were the 20 and 30-somethings. Those were sort of the best and the brightest of Russian society. So what does it mean longer term for Russian society and for ultimately support for Putin and the kind of regime he's running?
Okay, Carol Savitz, thanks so much for being with us today. Next up, the stage is nearly set for the trial against former President Donald Trump and 18 co-defendants for attempting to steal the 2020 election in Georgia. Preliminary hearings have already begun, and prosecutors are hoping for a 4-month-long trial with more than 150 witnesses. Trump and each of his 18 co-defendants are all facing RICO charges, named after the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law created on state and federal levels to go after gang leaders and mob bosses. So what exactly goes into a RICO case, and how is the one against Trump shaping up so far? I'm joined by Brian Kelly, a former attorney with the DOJ who prosecuted Whitey Bulger in 2013 under RICO charges. He's now a partner at Nixon Peabody. Brian.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Great, Brian, and thanks so much for joining us today. So,
Sure.
Thanks to Donald Trump, the average American president is now facing 2 indictments, although I think they're all a little bit concentrated at the tail. So can you explain to us that since RICO is a word that most of us only encounter in the movies, what does that mean? What does it mean to say that he's facing a RICO and charges?
Okay, so RICO is an acronym for racketeering, the entire name of the statute. And it was passed federally in the late 60s. And soon thereafter, multiple states passed copycat laws patterned after the federal RICO statute. And it's designed to be a very broad statute that the prosecutors can use to go after. Originally, it was for mafia cases, things like that, but it's been utilized since then in a variety of contexts. So that's one of the bases for us prosecuting Whitey Bulger a few years back. And, that was just one defendant, and it took 2 months. But the RICO statute itself is a very powerful weapon for the prosecutors, because it's very broad and they can present evidence that they might otherwise not be able to use at a trial. They have to prove there's an enterprise. Now, an enterprise, it can be IBM. I mean, just because it's an enterprise doesn't mean it's sinister. It can also be a mafia family. And the prosecutors here are going to have to prove somehow this group of 19 people formed some sort of political enterprise. But that doesn't end their obligations. They then have to show that this enterprise and the people involved agreed to 2 or more racketeering acts. And racketeering acts are simply crimes. And the RICO statutes, whether it's federal, whether it's state, they name a whole bunch of crimes that can be considered RICO acts or predicate crimes. And there's so many different federal crimes, not all of them count as a federal racketeering act or a state racketeering act. In Georgia, it's actually a little broader than the federal RICO charge, and there's more crimes that count, so to speak. And the classic ones are like extortion or gambling or drug dealing and even murder, which is several of the RICO predicates, I should say, against Bulger. So that it's a very broad statute that the prosecutors are using, and it allows them to present a lot more evidence than they otherwise would. So if you just have a tax evasion charge, you can't start bringing in all this other evidence that's not relevant to that charge. But with a RICO charge, the prosecution has an enormous advantage because it can throw a lot of stuff against the wall and say, listen, Judge, it's admissible because it pertains to either the enterprise or the racketeering acts. And there's all these different legal tests about what's an enterprise. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's what it is.
So, Brian, the idea, if I understand you correctly, is that if you are part of this corrupt enterprise, even if you did not commit the specific acts that are being charged to another member of the enterprise, you can still be criminally liable for them. Is that right?
Not exactly. The enterprise itself does not have to be corrupt. The enterprise, like I said, could be IBM, but it's the pattern of racketeering that has to be criminal. And there's a conspiracy racketeering, and there's what's called a substantive racketeering. If you're charged with substantive RICO, you yourself have to commit 2 or more. Here, I believe they charge a conspiracy to violate the RICO statute. That's even easier for the prosecutor to do because the defendant just has to agree that somebody in the enterprise was going to commit 2 or more predicate acts. So a defendant doesn't necessarily have to commit 2 or more. He has to know and agree that somebody else is. And these racketeering acts can be wire fraud, mail fraud, things of that nature. And I think in the Georgia statute, there's also politically related crimes that are being alleged. I don't know all the exact predicate acts that have been alleged in Georgia, but if it's a conspiracy charge, you yourself do not have to commit 2 or more, but somebody does, and you have to know about it and agree to it.
So does this pose constitutional problems? Is that a defense that Donald Trump is likely to use?
Well, I mean, the defense will always try to preserve legal issues in the event of a conviction. That's what they do for their appeal. But this stuff has been vetted at the highest level, the U.S. Supreme Court, many times. And this conspiracy, this idea that a conspiracy charge is easier to prove, it just is. And that's a matter of well-settled law. And it's unlikely to be something that the defendants can effectively attack on appeal.
So when you look at the case against Donald Trump, does it, I mean, you're not part of it, but you've surely looked at it. Does it meet your smell test that this is a plausible RICO prosecution?
I don't know. It's questionable here. It feels a little bit like they're piling on with all these other cases. And the fact that they're trying to have the trial right on Super Tuesday for 19 defendants seems a little crazy, honestly, because, as I said, a one defendant RICO trial involving Whitey Bulger took 2 months. It's just inconceivable that they can do all 19 defendants, including the ex-president of the United States, in one courtroom in March of this year. It took us almost 2 years to get Bulger to trial. There's a mountain of evidence. Because the RICO statute is so broad, as we've discussed, the defense is allowed to go through the evidence and be prepared. So it's kind of extraordinary to say we'll have a 19-person trial, 6 months from now. It's just, that seems a little artificially rushed. And I think a lot of people think it's political, the timing of the trial. So, we shall see. It's up to the jury to decide who's credible in that courtroom and who isn't, and what, how is the evidence going to hold up under cross-examination. I mean, Trump's defense is going to be, this is just arguing about election like others have done is not a crime, blah, blah, blah. That's, and who knows how that's going to play in front of a Georgia jury.
So one problem that Donald Trump has had in many of his trials is his sort of inability to retain counsel. It sounds to me like from your description that having really, really good defense attorneys is crucial in a RICO prosecution. Is that going to be?
I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I think having a good attorney is crucial in every case, but certainly in something like this. This is high stakes, obviously super high stakes. The whole country's watching, and I honestly, as I sit here, I don't know who his counsel is in that case, but absolutely, if he's in the fight, he's fighting for his liberty. So I would assume he'd have to get some talented defense attorneys to assist.
So what would be, do you think that there is a danger of this statute being used in other political disputes, as, sort of the Trump defenders are often proclaiming? Or does this seem to you like a unique set of facts that's unlikely to cause sort of slippery slope problems?
Well, I mean, this particular statute seems like the facts are pretty unique here. But I think there's always a bit of a danger. And in fact, the Department of Justice used to have a policy that as you get closer to an election, you cannot indict a political case because you don't want to be accused of affecting the election. So, the problem comes in, though, if you don't indict and you have evidence of corruption, that's another way of affecting the election because you haven't exposed it. So it gets very tricky for the Department of Justice about when to indict. But, for instance, I know there's a lot of complaints now that, why wasn't Hillary indicted? Why isn't, this, at a certain point, the old days, at least, it used to be, well, let's not put the country through all these criminal cases. But now, certainly a unique set of facts. And there is some risk that in the future, maybe it won't be a district attorney in a big city. Maybe it was somebody in rural America who indicts, a Democrat. And then it would become kind of an unfortunate back and forth using the criminal justice system for political purposes. So I'm not saying that's happening here. I'm just saying, yes, you're right. That's a risk.
So in your judgment, as an experienced prosecutor, presenting with this set of facts, given that it is unique to have the President of the United States call Secretary of State for a state and threaten him with criminal prosecution if he doesn't find votes, is that something where you would have made the call to prosecute?
I'd have to know a lot more facts. I've heard a lot of facts back and forth about this matter, so I'd have to really study it. And you'd have to also consider, well, what else is out there? Is it really necessary to have a state case when you got two very serious federal cases now? The New York case, frankly, is pretty weak and should not have been brought, in my opinion, by the New York DA. But these two federal cases are serious cases. You have a fairly garden variety obstruction charge down in Florida that appears difficult on its face for the former president. And now you have a federal case in D.C. As well. So, how many cases do you need to hold somebody accountable and make your points? And there are different jurisdictions, though. So states, it's just like with the drug case, both the state and federal have different jurisdictions, and they both can bring a case. Usually, the federal side brings it and holds people accountable. So, I don't know how much discussion there is back and forth between these different sovereigns.
So Brian,
it does seem like a lot.
Last question. How concerned would you be by the possibility of a self-pardon if Trump were to win, and that might be the argument for a state prosecution?
Well, I don't know. I don't even know that if that's constitutionally permissible. I'd have to research if you could self-pardon on a federal case. That's a good point. That would have to be considered. But it's not like the statute of limitation is blown here. The Georgia can sit back and wait. I don't think the statute of limitations will be gone. So if that's really their concern, they can pull the trigger later on a case if they want to.
Thanks, Brian. Well, thank you for being with us here today.
Sure, absolutely. Take care.
On hot days like this, we can find ourselves looking for the cool shade of a tree. But that's easier to find in some neighborhoods than in others. Town to town, and even sometimes street to street, there are wide disparities in the number of trees. Advocacy groups Speak for the Trees took us on a community tree walk through Dorchester's Codman Square to see firsthand where we need more of them. Let's take a look.
I was kind of disappointed because they, in my complex, they took all the trees down. And I'm asking them, can we have our trees back? Because we breathe better. And I think it was more cheaper to get rid of the trees rather than trim them.
So last week, we did our first tree walk here in Codman Square, and we explored west of Washington Street. Today, we're going to explore east of Washington Street. We're going to check out where there are trees and where there are not trees.
Trees are inequitably distributed in every major urban area. There's a correlation between tree canopy coverage and historic and continued racist practices like redlining, like disinvestment, white flight.
We end up distributing air conditioners because it's so hot because everyone's like on this heat island. You know, there's a lot of concrete.
Oh, well, look at this. This is interesting. You see this letter here? That's the letter T.
Tree.
Which means that they've determined that they're going to plant a tree here. Whether it's going to be tomorrow or next year is anyone's guess. So this is what we call a tree desert. And in a street like this, you'll have summer temperatures anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees hotter in the day. And these neighborhoods actually don't cool down as much at night because the asphalt has absorbed all that sunlight during the day.
This is Moultrie Street, and on this side of Moultrie, there are no trees. And if you look to the right,
It just says a lot about how we care about communities that don't have a lot. I think it says a lot about agency of when you do have a home and you have a little bit more flexibility to decide what your yard looks like, or if you want to plant a tree, or if you live in public housing or in areas where there isn't that kind of say.
there used to be a tree right there. Now it's a piece of asphalt blocking that whole area.
It can't be just the city, it can't be just the state. It has to be everyone literally rolling up their sleeves, advocating for trees, advocating for their preservation.
That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Adam Riley and his panel will dig into the latest on the Boston City Council elections after a year of conflict and controversy. Plus, dozens of proposals just cleared a major hurdle to appear on state ballots next fall. Which ones can we expect to vote on next year? And finally, the head of Roxbury Community College on the impact of the state's new free tuition program for adults 25 and older. That and more tomorrow at 7. I'm Gautam Mukunda. Thanks for watching and good night.
Linkage blindness.